So, there was a recent article put out by the New York Times focused on covering the launch of a boomerang streaming service, hosting lots of the classic cartoons of old, nothing noteworthy there. However, following this portion of the article, its author Glenn Kenny begins discussing Crunchyroll, and his handling of that service and the anime that it is home to ended up sparking a noteworthy backlash. I would not deem this worthy of coverage, but his behavior following this, including threats of police and legal action directed towards fairly civil individuals, has been so unprofessional and disturbing that I feel compelled to spread what awareness of it my platform will allow. Glenn and at least one fellow journalist have mocked the backlash, and in this instance made fun of a response on the grounds that that response came from someone with a small platform, suggesting it was a mere attention stunt. So if it's an existing platform that is required for legitimacy in their eyes, I'll offer a response. Hopefully my nearly 30,000 subscribers and 1.3 million views within the last 30 days is sufficient to make me a real human being in his eyes. To keep it brief, when he brings up Crunchyroll, he describes one anime series from the platform, Akashic Records of Bastard Magical Instructor, making note of its guy walking into the girls' changing room scene. The defense of this is that he's just literally describing something in a show on Crunchyroll, but the journalistic oversight is in failing to provide any sort of context to that description. That is the only information the reader is given about the nature of their television offering. He also brings up Fist of the North Star, but that's the 1986 movie, and so the prospective reader with little or no knowledge of the medium and service is given no reason to believe that Akashic Records is anything other than representative of the service at the very least, and even TV or modern anime as a whole perhaps. Glenn even reinforces that idea by following the description of that scene with, "This kind of thing can keep a person busy for hours, I'm sure," suggesting that the mass consumption of specifically this type of distasteful content is the draw for people. And it is for some. Once again, he isn't factually inaccurate, but in failing to bring up even the idea of any other appeal for those watching TV anime on Crunchyroll, he says this one, likely to be viewed negatively type of fan exists, and makes no suggestions about another kind being on this site. Surely instead of, "This kind of thing can keep a person busy for hours, I'm sure," which mocks such a person by suggesting Glenn is above that, he could have started the paragraph following his mention of Akashic Records with something more along the lines of, "Now this is just one of a diverse range of TV offerings on the service," before going into the, "But I'm more focused on film, so let's discuss that follows." Add to that condescending and misrepresentative tone a bunch of odd little tidbits like him mentioning Boomerang having 1,000 episodes, a figure that includes television episodes, but then having his only mention of the amount of content on Crunchyroll being in reference to its slim film offerings, when presumably if he did them the same courtesy he did Boomerang and included television episodes, it would be a much more impressive figure, a demonstration of some degree of a limited understanding of what exactly would qualify a given Crunchyroll title as a film, and thus throwing into question how accurate his claim that their offerings in that regard are slim, and a flat-out factual inaccuracy when he claims that Crunchyroll doesn't have the dub of the Fist of the North Star film, and you've got an article with some legitimate holes and potential for some nasty backlash. It just seems like he was fundamentally unsuited to discuss this subject. He had virtually no knowledge of Crunchyroll and seemingly the modern anime landscape as a whole, or at least failed to convey any of that knowledge in this article, and as the factual inaccuracies demonstrate, his abilities to research that information were not sufficient. I don't know if the title was his, as editors will write those sometimes, but either way, the "of fresh anime" portion does not accurately describe this piece, because he offers an extremely limited view of that fresh anime, too limited to give a general audience a meaningful perspective on it. As mentioned, though, it was his petulant behavior in response to the ensuing backlash that was the more prominent issue. In response to a post by Thoughts That Move laying out some of these factual inaccuracies and noting the advertisement-like press release style of his discussion of this Boomerang streaming service, Glenn said, "I forgot how butthurt you fans get," a tweet that he has since deleted in embarrassing and spineless fashion, it seems. I can't know whether or not he actually read that post, but in either case, replying in this manner to something pointing out an undeniable factual mistake with your writing in an established journalistic publication is an incredibly bad look for a supposed professional. Oh, but his deleted tweets get even more egregious, and thankfully these ones were screenshotted before he could scramble to delete them. In response to the tweet exchange surrounding that post, that tweet from the guy apparently suggesting that you needed to have a large enough audience already that you wouldn't have the motivation of audience growth out there to comment upon an issue, and therefore locking out anyone with a small audience from getting involved in such discussions without being accused of an ulterior motive specifically, the man known here on YouTube as Roger Smith 2004 refuted the childish employment of the buzzword hit piece to describe a post that pointed out objective factual oversights, and got into an exchange with Glenn himself. He puzzlingly mocks Roger's use of the term "you people" to describe these two specific people, the limitations of his grasp of the nuances of the English language that show themselves in his article once again showing themselves here. It seems he misinterpreted "you people" to be a silly placing of all people critical of anime into a single group by Roger in an act of childish defensiveness towards his medium, but ironically enough, Glenn's missing of what was actually its obvious meaning here was itself a display of such childish defensiveness on his part. At this point, Glenn simply goes off the deep end, and proceeds to say that he is attempting to elicit death threats in order to report Roger. Now, I can be fairly confident that this was not serious on Glenn's part, him making a mockery of what I assume is the likely reception of actual death threats from angered fans, and how easily he perceives anime fans as a whole to be to provoke. But either way, this is absolutely appalling behavior, and an example of the same elitist, derisive tone that set people off in the first place. Here's the real issue. Let's say that your position is that Glenn's behavior was justified, that he had been attacked, and so such an outburst is to be expected. Well then, him attacking people like Roger in this way would give them the justification to retaliate themselves, and soon with the sending of one unjustified death threat to begin the chain reaction, you've got a mass of people all threatening each other and being totally justified in doing so. You simply cannot hold the view that Glenn was in the right here with such behavior. After being asked to send Glenn a death threat, Roger replies that he doesn't need death threats, and by this point Glenn's paranoia has set in so thoroughly that he seems to be perceiving that stated lack of a need for threats as a threat itself. Either that, or he knows it wasn't at all a threat, and is simply pretending to interpret it as such in order to threaten Roger here with some undefined quoting of it somewhere. Seemingly out of witty retorts, Glenn leaves with the threat of police and legal action, and therefore has said his piece. What the fuck? Is what I want to say in response to this, but can't in order to retain my air of intellectualism here, and thus I've concocted this meta-framing of that phrase in order to do both. Clearly, this is totally outside the bounds of journalistic professionalism on Glenn's part. His deletion of those tweets seems to suggest that he's aware of this to some degree. But there's also a larger issue here surrounding the nature of internet blowback. We've seen it within the anime fandom in other instances in the past, like with the Mary Sue article criticizing fan service, and we see it in similar blowbacks from just about every group when similar situations arise. If you put something out there that creates a reaction and upsets people, you'll get negative feedback. That much is simple and to be expected. If you create a large enough negative reaction, the size of that group of angry people will be large enough that just based upon statistical inevitability alone, it will encompass some of the people that are immature enough to respond in a manner that should be condemned. In many cases, so immature because they are literally children or very close to it. The understandable but also totally incorrect response to such blowback that we see far too often is a quick and deep entrenchment in one's own ideas on the part of the writer, and a stance of total derision taken towards any of their critics. They foolishly assume that because they have irrational critics that all or at least most of their critics must be irrational, and that they have no grounds for their complaints. They have a few children throw mean words at them, and then wrongfully assume that everyone who shares that general view of "you're wrong" is a child, proceeding to treat them as such, which we saw with Thoughts and Roger here. The complaint is that he was condescending towards anime fans, and when they respond angrily to this, all the jokes about anime fans being basement-dwelling losers get whipped out. Sure, the bad behavior of some of them justified your view of them as immature to a degree, but your expression of that attitude and wrong-headed application of it to a massive group of people confirms all of their view of you as an elitist asshole. The internet will expose you to the idiots, the worst of every group, stance, and fandom, and it falls upon our shoulders to meet that vitriol with the understanding that this is, of course, only a small fraction of the most extreme and vitriolic of that group, and not come to the incorrect conclusion that just because our arguments and viewpoints can defeat their counterpoint when it's argued by an intellectual 5-year-old, that those counterpoints don't actually hold at least some merit that we might be able to see if we're receptive to the rational arguments for them. Glenn put forth an embarrassing display that demonstrated a state of mind which probably means he will be closed off to this video, though I'd love for him to prove these expectations incorrect. But hopefully we can spread this awareness of the unfortunate nature of internet discourse and how we should attempt to conduct ourselves in the face of it. Shitty reactions from the general public help to fuel the derision towards that public on the part of journalists that's been increasingly complained about in recent months. But these shitty reactions from derisive journalists in turn fuel that mounting distrust the public has for them. At least one of these sides is going to have to amend their behavior for there to be any hope of working towards solving this issue. But there's one group whose paycheck is dependent upon that happening and one whose isn't, so that former group may want to be especially committed to making it happen.